what problems were around. And I saw this image that we're going to analyze today, and it has a lot of nice features to go through. So the disclosures are that it's no endorsement of any particular mode, manufacturer, or company. We're equal employers. Give us whichever mode or ventilator you have. We love it. We will analyze it. Whatever we say, it's our opinion. It does not represent the Cleveland Clinic. There are my disclosures for myself and Rob Chatburn. We're both co-hosts for this SEVA VentRounds occurring today. Some ground rules. They're very simple. Just keep your microphone muted. We may call upon you to comment, but the main way to interact with us is through the chat. Put your comments there. If we need you to do a little bit deeper comments, we'll ask you to unmute yourself and let us know what's going on. This session offers CME for the CCF employees and CRCE for any respiratory therapy joining today. For the respiratory therapist, just remember to enter the name in the chat to verify attendance. And then there will be an evaluation that Ryan Kutro will add up into the chat, and you just have to complete that evaluation, and that's it. You get your CRCE. So this is the key SEVA knowledge. We always start with one of these, and the key SEVA knowledge is when you're looking at the waveforms in the ventilator, remember that if you control the breath, the breath control variable is pressure, then you look at the flow. And if the breath control variable is flow, then you look at the pressure waveform. I mean, there will be always abnormalities on both waveforms. You will always be able to look at little details, but usually your eyes should be looking there. And the other common key SEVA knowledge that you need to be aware is that the volume waveform on the ventilators resets to 0 with every breath, meaning it doesn't accumulate the prior volume that got trapped in the last breath or in the next one. It's when the breath starts, it triggers, it goes back to 0 and starts from there. Rob, comments on this. Can you tell us a little bit why do we look at flow when we're controlling pressure, just so that the team is aware?
Well, this theory comes from the equation of motion, which says that pressure is equal to elastance times volume plus resistance times flow. So if you control the left-hand side, then pressure is never going to change no matter what the mechanics do. Only flow and volume change. On the other hand, if you're controlling the right-hand side of the equation, volume control, then volume and flow are never going to change with mechanics. Only the left-hand side pressure is going to change. So that's where that comes from.
Excellent. So I'm going to show you the waveform as I was walking by in the unit, and this is a little bit off the usual way that we do VentRounds. I'm going to show you the image and make a couple of comments, and then we'll go to analyze it. And the screen is a little bit amplified for you to be able to see the waveforms better. For whatever reason, on this ventilator, when we print the images, the screenshots, it doesn't see, you cannot see it as best as we would like to. It's a little bit thin, so these are enhanced. But if you look at the mode is up here on the left upper corner, and you can see the type of mode or the commercial name of the mode. And I would ask Rob, if you look at this waveform, Rob, are you concerned? Is there anybody concerned if you would see this waveform, you would say, oh, there's something terrible happening to this patient?
Yeah, there's a high frequency oscillation in there.
Yeah, these little things, right?
Yeah.
But that you could say, yeah, it's cardiac oscillations, whatever. It's just noise. It's not, I mean, clinically probably irrelevant, those little things, right? So,
Maybe.
I mean, if you look at it, it's getting each one of the breaths as the patient wants. It's getting the size that it is. So here's why, and this highlights the point. What we're controlling on this breath is pressure. So here's the rest of the waveform. And now it creates this stress on you, right? So completely a nice pressure waveform and a completely horrendous flow and volume waveform that actually you cannot see the flow. So that's what actually caught my eye as I was walking. The patient did not have any volume tracing, and it appeared now and then, and I said, oh, I gotta go see this. All right, so let's do an analysis of this waveform. So this is a good example in my mind why you have to, if you're controlling pressure, you go and look at the flow waveform. All righty. So here we are. Here's the waveform. I took out all the other settings that you saw on the screen so that we could see it a little bit more amplified. And the first question for the group, and just put it on the chat, is what's the tag for this mode? And this is a key item of what we're trying to define. Is what it's important for us to know what's the breath control variable, what's the breath sequence, and what's the targeting sim. So go at it. Have no fear. Right, and I see one of the attendees has put in the target. So as the target, the tag is PC CMBS, and what that stands is that we're controlling the pressure during inspiration, and so you can see that the ventilator is maintaining the pressure during the inspiration throughout. And then CMB stands for continuous mandatory ventilation, and mandatory means that all the breaths are mandatory, and a mandatory breath means that it's triggered by time, in this case, or the machine, or cycled by the machine. And so in this case, actually, this ventilator does a little thing in which it will make little triangles appear to tell you that this is a patient trigger. And you can actually you do not see any of these triangles anywhere, which immediately tells you that these are breaths triggered by the ventilator. There's no other, I mean, the classic thing that is in many books that shows the drop in pressure before, I would say it's not a complete trustworthy way to assess that. Sometimes you'll see it. But in this case, the ventilator, this mode of this ventilator in particular would show you little arrows, and you'll see it in an example later on. And then it's cycled by time, meaning that you set the I time, and it's cycled by time, each one of the breaths. So you can see they are the exact same size. So each one of these breaths, actually right now, that we're seeing are mandatory right here. And that's because they're triggered by the machine and cycled by the machine. And then set point means that this is the most basic type of targeting or programming that we can do on the ventilator, and we essentially told the machine to deliver the same amount of inspiratory time and inspiratory pressure for each breath, and that was set by you. The set points were set by you. Rob, talk to us.
One thing to point out is that this ventilator mode is called PC plus, and you'll say, well, what's the plus mean, right? Well, it means in this case, I believe, that you have an active exhalation valve, which means that the patient can breathe in and out during a mandatory pressure controlled breath. Where other modes in the same ventilator won't let you do that. Earlier versions of the ventilator wouldn't let you do that. Other ventilators won't let you do that in pressure control. Why? I don't know. But the proof is the second breath. And you can see flow goes through 0 in the expiratory direction during the inspiratory time.
Excellent. Thank you, Rob.
Mm-hmm.
So now let's take a look at the load. So the next item is the load. And the key here is you're looking, because we're controlling pressure, you're going to look at the flow waveform. And when there's PMOS, most of the time you're unable to see if there's elastic or resistive load, because it will obscure by the activity of the muscle. So by looking at this waveform, what do you think is the main load on this patient? Elastic, resistive, or PMOS? Thank you, Kirsten. All righty, so here a little bit of both. All righty, so let's take a look at the waveform. So what you're trying, remember, because you're controlling pressure, if it is a passive breath, you would expect during inspiration to see a peak and then an exponential decay. And when the patient exhales, if it's passive, you expect to see a peak and then an exponential decay. That's what you would expect in a beautiful, nice, passive environment. And by looking at the exponential decay, you can see the time constant. And if it's prolonged, it takes a long period of time. And if it is short and it returns to baseline rapidly, then a short time constant. So during inspiration on the first breath, we see the peak, but then we see that it crosses really rapidly below actually baseline, which means that the patient is now exhaling, and it went down rapidly, and then the breath ended, and now we're in exhalation. So there's evidence of some type of PMOS, but actually it's PMOS for the patient to exhale. So that's hiding what's the physiology there. Through the next breath, you actually see the opposite. Again, the flow is going up before even the breath, and then during the breath, it's kind of amputated, so you cannot read very well there. In the fourth breath, there was actually inspiration occurring before, and then there's pressurization, and there's no exponential decay, and the next one. So during inspiration, I cannot really comment on it. I think that there's PMOS throughout it. And then during expiration, you see here the peak and an exponential or a decay, and then these oscillations, and then it changes again. The peak, it decays, and then oscillations again. A peak that it's partially amputated, perhaps. It doesn't look as nice as this one. And then this one with a decay falls probably within 2 seconds. And each one of these little markers is a second. So I see a couple of people that thought that this could be a resistive pattern because it's taking some time to return, but there's a lot of oscillations there. So it's hard to see, but that could be a potential. But I would say that it's very hard to see. I cannot see it very well, which when I cannot see it, I don't like saying it, but I would say that if anything, there's PMOS in some, and there is perhaps a hint of resistance because it's taking some time, but there's a lot of oscillations there. Roberto, thoughts?
I don't know, on the first breath and second breath, it looks like it's decayed almost to zero within a second.
Well, this is the second.
Hard to tell, right?
Yeah, that's why I cannot really. I mean, I see all these little suckers here, so I'm not sure.
Yeah, and you don't know how big of a volume got exhaled there because some of it got exhaled during the inspiration.
Yeah,
It's
so I will.
indeterminate, yeah.
I would say I'm not gonna bet on this one. I'm just gonna say I cannot tell. So I think that many people put that there was PMOS, and so let's go to the patient ventilator discordance. And so all the breaths, we start by trigger. So all the breaths on this are mandatory. So they're triggered by the machine. However, you would agree with me if we look that what we're looking is at the flow waveform, and I'm going to start with the second breath just for the sake of looking at it, right? So here's exhalation. Here starts exhalation right here, and the patient starts exhaling, and then suddenly the breath crosses baseline, right? And so now it's above. And what does that mean normally? That the patient is inhaling, right? That there's flow going into the patient. So from this point here, I would say all the way here, if I draw it, there's evidence of activity that the patient is inhaling. And then finally, the breath activates by time. And if you look at this with a little bit of evil eyes, you may see a little bit of a downslope occurring in the pressure waveform. It's not massive, but there's a little bit of a pressure. But I would not call it if just looking at it from out there. So that's why, but the flow is showing that the patient is taking a breath in. Then the system pressurizes, and it's like the patient actually was now trying to exhale, and there's a little bit up, and then the breath ends and the patient exhales. So essentially there's minimal to no breath being delivered during this, the period of time that the patient is getting the breath. The patient got the breath before that. And this one was incomplete. This was a terrible picture, but if you see this picture over here, this one tells the story even better. If we go to breath number 3. So again, it's coming up, and then it starts going above. So like the patient, then the breath pressurizes, right? The breath gets, and then actually in this case, there seems to be a good synchrony on the cycle, and the patient exhales. It's actually somewhat amputated here. So if I would mark what PMOS is for this patient, and it would start right here when it crosses negative flow, and it ends probably around here. This is how long PMOS is, this length from here to here. And in this one, I would say that PMOS, inspiratory PMOS, goes from here probably to here, somewhat like that. Rob, what do you think about that?
I was curious why it didn't trigger a breath. If they're inhaling, why didn't it trigger a breath?
Excellent question, Tim. So just by looking at this, if you would name this type of desynchrony, how would you call it? The breath, the PMOS starts here and the breath starts here. What's the name of this for the team? Is it normal? Is the breath triggering early? Is the breath triggering late? Is it false or failed? So in this case, it's a late trigger, meaning that the patient started over here at this point, and the ventilator delivered all the way over here. So the patient was going at its rhythm over here, and you can see it on the next one. It's even more evident. You can see here, the patient was taking its breath, and then the machine pressurized, and then it ended. So the name of this is a late trigger. And I'm going to show you something in the next one. But before I go there, so remember, when we find the first desynchrony, that's the one that we are going to treat for this patient to try to improve this. And I think that, Tim, I'm going to answer your question in a couple of seconds or minutes. But first, I want to show you what's happening actually to the volume waveform. And the volume waveform is very tricky. So remember, every time the breath starts, the triggers, it resets. So you see the reset here. You see the reset here. You see the reset here. And you see the reset here, right? So you see how, and what happens is that this patient is actually, when the breath gets reset, to start the breath gets a little bit, but the patient is already exhaling, and so only got this amount of breath in, which is this little area over here. And then the patient exhaled forcefully for all this, and then starts breathing again, but it doesn't get the back to baseline because he's exhaling more than it can. And I think that this is going to make more sense when I show you this image. So when I saw that, I got concerned with the patient, and I did an expiratory pause. So what you see here on the patient is the patient gets an inspiration here and inspiration here, and I activated the expiratory pause, and so the expiratory pause gets active at this point over here, around here. And I want you to see what now the patient is doing. And so there's a small inspiratory effort, and then the pressure goes up, so the patient is bearing down, increasing the pressure. Then the patient takes a breath in, and this goes down like that. Then the patient bears down again against the machine, and then breaths again. So the patient was bearing down against the machine with very small inspiratory efforts, if that makes. So all of these that I'm shading is expiratory effort from the patient. So now that you know this, look at the waveform over here, and it kind of makes sense that it had, when the patient took a breath in, it had very small inspiratory efforts, and then a lot of expiratory time on this patient. Rob, does that make sense?
Yeah, it's sort of like an inverse of a normal breathing pattern.
Yeah. So now the question is, well, the patient is triggering, but it's late triggering. Why is this patient late triggering? And the causes for late triggering are, you can put them on the chat, but there's only a few causes of late trigger. So one of the causes, as I'm seeing responses come in, the classic cause that people would say is auto peep, right? So that's a good cause of a late trigger. The other one is a poorly set sensitivity or trigger threshold. Yes, Arcel, that's correct. So I'm going to show. So I saw this and I said, what's happening here? Why is the patient not triggering? So I was not paying much attention. I just pressed the button and I changed the patient to pressure support. Okay, so now you can see it's spontaneous. That's the name of the mode on this ventilator, but the tag is PC CSV S. So meaning that all the breaths are triggered by the patient and cycled by the patient. And you may remember I told you that if the patient is triggering, you're going to see this triangle. And you don't see any triangles here, but actually look at the patient. You see how it's generating a tidal volume of 500 or 480, and it's not triggering any breaths. It's at a PEEP of 5 with a pressure support of 12, and there's none of the breaths are being triggered, but you can see the flow goes up, right? The patient takes a breath in, and then the patient exhales. Breath in, patient exhales. Why is that happening? So this patient is not triggering any of the breaths, even though the patient is doing effort and enough effort to get flow because of the active valve that Rob, right? So the patient is breathing on CPAP. So the alarm, the apnea alarm keeps sounding. And the answer is what Arcel did. I went and pressed controls, and somebody had set the pressure, the ventilator to a pressure trigger with a sensitivity of close to 3 negative pressure. And that was enough for this patient not to generate enough to trigger the machine. So I changed it to a flow trigger, and that's what happened. So the learning point here, and you can now see very nicely for each breath that it's triggered with the flow trigger, and you can see the little triangle there. The patient gets the breath in and then exhales, and the patient has it has a long inspiratory effort, but you can see it much better how the patient exhales. So this was a case in which I presume that somebody overnight was trying to fight the false triggering from the cardiac oscillations, and this led to a very high pressure trigger that was not triggering for the ventilator. And now I can show you here, after we did that, the patient stopped bearing down. So now you can see, again, an occlusion pressure. So we did an end expiratory pause. And you can see the PMOS goes from here to here with the patient essentially inhaling all this time. And over here, again, this amount of time and not bearing down. So it's the pressure staying at the level of PEEP. So we went from a distressed individual fighting against the ventilator, blowing hard, to a case in which the patient now is doing a natural breathing and getting the breath in and not bearing down as the patient is breathing. So I thought that this was a good example for all us to review.
Uh,
Well, yeah, go ahead.
Most
Tim.
vents, aren't they defaulted to a flow trigger? I was curious why that would have been a -3 pressure trigger unless
Yeah.
someone changed it from flow to pressure.
That's correct, Tim. I think that this was changed because of it's possible this patient came at extremis overnight, and this could also be easily a case where there could be false triggering from these oscillations that you can see over here. So, and probably that was occurring, and the clinician at night changed it to do so. And what happened is that then the effort of the patient at that time was in such a way that was not generating enough pressure to trigger. It was generating enough flow, but not enough pressure drop because of the way that the patient was breathing. So, and then it became an issue when I was walking around that room. So, yeah, that's the case. But I think that this highlights 3 items if you're gonna go home with a message. The first one, when you control pressure, you look at the flow. When you don't know what's happening, sometimes putting them on pressure support will help you see what's happening. You can then look at the flow waveforms. And if not, a very good diagnostic maneuver is to do an end expiratory pause. A short expiratory pause, 10 seconds, will let you see what actually the PMOS is doing, and then adjust that to your ventilator.
That's cool. That's good.
Yeah, really good. Here are the CMEs for the CCF caregivers. Just put this code in my learning. For the CRCEs, there will be a link appearing on the chat suddenly soon. There's a question here that says, what generates the volume if there is not pressure curve in PCC SBS? Oh, so I think, Victor, the question that I get is how come this patient gets volume if there's no pressure being delivered by the ventilator, and that is all PMOS, as you put it on the bottom. So the PMOS is now essentially this patient was breathing on CPAP as you saw them here. So, and the ventilator is maintaining the pressure constant at that time, and that's another reason why to keep your eyes looking at the flow waveform, because the ventilators are designed to maintain the pressure at that time, and so you may not be able to see the changes in the pressure waveform because of that. So that's the rationale. So thank you, Rob, for putting the equation of motion. So definitely, it's the PMOS generating all the volume at this time. Other questions or comments?
Yeah,
One question, Eduardo.
Yeah.
You speculated on the cause of that. Was there any charting in the patient's record that would indicate that, or did someone just do this and not pass forward what they had done?
It was speculation, Rob. That's how, because in general, I would say, as many have highlighted today, the common thing is that our RTs use flow trigger for all the patients. And whenever I see a pressure trigger, it's a manifestation that something was causing a disturbance on the force. And so that it's an educated guess, but I have no proof of that. And actually, I could go back and look at the at the log on the ventilator to see what they were seeing, but that's the event.
Yeah,
There
makes
was
sense to
another
me too.
question here.
Yeah, I had a question, Abigail. Like you showed on
Yeah,
the
go ahead.
pressure curve that is able to generate at least minus 15 centimeters of water pressure. So if he was able to do that, how could he not overcome the 3 centimeter waters of pressure for the trigger?
Yeah, that's a great question. What I think, I mean, this is the one that you see here, Tim, Adi, is after the fact. So I think the dynamics had changed when you can see actually how the patient is breathing over here. When it was before, you can see how the patient was spending most of the time. I mean, this is after I did the pause, but the first one, you can see how little effort he generates, and I think that he was bearing down and then would try to take the breath in, and because he was bearing down and the pressure was high, the ventilator was getting fooled by it, and it was unable to trigger at that time from all the effort that the patient was doing. That's again, I don't have this is as close as I have to that image of what was happening that moment of time. But what it became very evident was the moment that we did the pause and we changed the trigger. This went away and the patient became synchronous and calm and in better shape. Go ahead, Tim.
I was just gonna say that I've used that technique many times and I get all confused. I throw them in a pressure support. And then I'm like, I start to make sense of what's going on. That's a good technique, but I never thought of putting them in doing an expiratory hold. That's another good
yeah, it highlights it very, very nicely, right? So and there's a good article by the group in Toronto that shows that just a single random expiratory pause and you capture the first breath, it's very close to the excursion that occurs in a esophageal catheter. So it's kind of catching the patient out of guard, and so they activate the muscle and it's going through the whole thing, but now with a valve closed, and you capture that, and then you release, and they continue to breathe. So obviously, as the time goes forward and you're breathing against a closed valve, that will change the pressure dynamics. So it's a single. The first occlusion is the one that matters for this group of patients. Yeah.
Would you speculate, Eduardo, that this could never happen if you were in NAVA?
Would this never? Yeah, I think so. I think that it wouldn't. It would not, because the trigger would be the EMG. So, and I'm avoiding. I didn't go into another thing that we did with this patient for another VentRounds, which was we used the intelligent algorithm for trying to, because when I saw this, I said, well, maybe the sensitivity is all wrong and we need this mode. This is the Hamilton, and we said let's use the IntelliSync, and that didn't work. But that's for another discussion on technology and how to use it appropriately, I would say. All right. Any other comments? All right. Well, I think that this was a great learning session, great input from the team. Thank you for speaking up and letting us know. And for those fellows that were logged in, I captured your names and you just got 30 points in the SEVA championship. So great job. Keep it going. Bye-bye.